She never said his name aloud, not even once. Even in the privacy of her chambers, when no one could hear, Daenerys Targaryen refused to speak the name Ned Stark, but the name lived in her thoughts like a wound that never healed. It wasn't just politics or the old stories her brother used to scream about when they were running for their lives. No, her hatred ran deeper, colder, like a quiet burn that never stopped aching. Daenerys had never met Eddard Stark. She had only seen his stone-faced image on scrolls once or twice, back when Ser Jorah was still by her side. Everyone in Westeros called him honorable, noble, a man of principle. But to Daenerys, he was the man who let her family die quietly, not with swords and fire, but with silence. She was just a baby when it all happened. Her father, the Mad King, Aerys II, had been overthrown, and Robert Baratheon sat on the Iron Throne. But in those final days when the Targaryens were hunted like wild dogs, Daenerys' mother died giving birth to her on the cold stone of Dragonstone. Her brother Viserys, barely more than a child himself, raised her in exile, but not with love, with rage. Every day Viserys told her about them, Robert, Tywin, and Ned Stark, the three names she grew up learning to loathe. But it was Ned Stark who confused her the most. He hadn't burned her kin. He hadn't ordered the deaths. He wasn't the king. In fact, he refused the crown. He lived far away in the north and kept to himself. Yet, he never raised his voice against the killings either. He never tried to protect the last Targaryen children. And most of all, he raised a Baratheon bastard while her brother and she were left to starve. That fact haunted her more than anything else. When she finally arrived in Westeros, when her dragon soared above the land that was once her home, she asked Tyrion about Ned Stark. Tyrion spoke of honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. How Ned tried to save the realm from civil war. How he died trying to protect the truth about Jon Snow. But Daenerys didn't see it that way. Jon Snow, that name cracked everything open. Her nephew, her blood. A Stark raised in Winterfell, but born of Rhaegar and Lyanna, a Targaryen, hidden in a wolf's den. And who kept him there? Ned Stark. All those years he could have written a letter, sent a raven, whispered to someone loyal to the Targaryens. But no, he raised Jon like a mistake. Let him grow up thinking he was a shameful accident of lust. He let her last living family grow up believing he was nothing. Even after all the battles, after all the people she lost, Missandei, Jorah, Rhaegal, even after burning King's Landing to ash and sitting alone in the Red Keep, it wasn't Cersei or Jon or even Tyrion that haunted her most. It was the ghost of a quiet man from the north who could have changed everything, but chose not to. She would dream sometimes, in the days before her death, of Dragonstone as it once was, of her mother's arms, of a life that could have been. A childhood not of fear and flight, but safety and love. If only Ned Stark had been a little less loyal to Robert, and a little more human. And though she never said his name, never uttered it even to Jon, she carried it with her like a stone tied to her spirit. That's why Daenerys never forgave him. Not because he killed her family, but because he let the rest of them die slowly, quietly, forgotten, while pretending he was different from the rest. There were moments when Daenerys tried to forget. Sometimes it happened in the quiet in the early morning, when the wind rolled over the sea and the dragons slept peacefully on the cliffs. In those moments, she'd close her eyes and pretend the past didn't exist. No Mad King, no rebellion, no betrayals, just her, the sky, and the fire in her blood. But the peace never lasted, because pain has a way of returning, especially the kind passed down from blood and history. And always somewhere beneath it all stood Ned Stark, that tall, silent figure from the north who, in her mind, symbolized everything that went wrong long before she was even old enough to understand it. When she first heard of him being executed, Daenerys felt nothing. She was in Korth then, surviving betrayal after betrayal. When the news reached her that Eddard Stark had been beheaded in King's Landing by King Joffrey, she didn't flinch. There was no joy, no sorrow, just silence. She didn't even know the man. But still, in her heart, she wished she had been the one to give the order. Not because of revenge, not entirely, but because his death should have meant something to her, and it didn't. That disturbed her. Years later, when she met Jon Snow and stood before the man who carried both Stark and Targaryen blood, the wound opened again. At first, she admired Jon, his strength, his honesty, his ability to rally men not with fear, but with loyalty. He reminded her of what leaders could be. But then came the truth. Jon wasn't just a Stark. He was Aegon Targaryen, her family, her blood, and Ned Stark had hidden him. Daenerys would sit alone in her war tent late at night, her fingers curled tightly around her goblet, thinking about the choice Ned Stark made. He let Jon grow up thinking he was unwanted, a bastard, when all along he was the son of Rhaegar, the rightful heir, a prince. She couldn't understand it. How could a man praised for his honor live such a lie? Some said Ned did it to protect the boy, that Robert would have killed Jon if he knew. But Daenerys didn't buy that excuse. If Ned Stark could betray his king to save one child, then why not send Jon to Essos? Why not send word to loyalists in exile? Why let her grow up hunted while her nephew grew up in a castle? It felt like betrayal, a quiet kind, the kind that doesn't make noise, doesn't spill blood in the streets, but slowly poisons everything from within. She began to see Ned Stark's so-called honor as a shield, one that allowed him to do nothing while others suffered, a shield that let him sleep at night while her family was wiped out, a shield he held up to the world while hiding a truth that could have changed everything. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this man, this stranger who had never laid eyes on her, had shaped her entire life from the shadows. His silence had shaped her exile. His choices had shaped her identity. And that kind of power, held by someone she never chose, felt like chains. And maybe that's why she burned the city. Not for madness, not for rage, but because somewhere deep in her, there was a belief that the old world had been built on quiet betrayals. Men like Ned Stark, with soft words and hard decisions, had ruled Westeros from behind masks of virtue, and she wanted to tear all of it down. Sometimes when she looked at Jon, she didn't see her ally or her love. She saw the ghost of the man who raised him. The man who stole her family from history, not with a sword, but with silence. That was the wound she could never speak of. That was why Daenerys never forgave Ned Stark. Because the greatest pain is not always caused by the people who try to kill you. Sometimes it comes from the people who let you die slowly, while pretending they were doing the right thing. She remembered the cold, not the chill of Winterfell or the winds of the north. Daenerys had never stepped foot there, but a different kind of cold. The kind you feel when you realize the world you dreamed of never really wanted you in it. The kind that lives under your skin when you're told you're the last of your name, and no one is coming to save you. She was still a child when she first heard the name Stark. It was whispered in fear by merchants, muttered by old knights who remembered Robert's rebellion. To her, the name Stark meant North, nobility, the ones who stayed silent. Her brother Viserys would spit the name like poison. They watched us burn and did nothing, he'd say. Ned Stark let your mother die alone. He let our family be erased from history. Back then, she thought he was just angry, bitter and broken by the life they were forced to live. But as she grew older, as she learned more of Westeros, she realized her brother wasn't completely wrong. Ned Stark had power, influence, even respect. He had the kind of name that could have protected the innocent, a voice that could have defended the last breaths of House Targaryen. But he chose silence. He chose safety. He chose to protect his own and let the rest vanish. And perhaps that was what hurt the most, because Daenerys had spent her entire life believing in the idea of justice, that the good would rise, that the innocent would be remembered. But what she saw in men like Ned Stark was something colder, a loyalty not to what was right, but to what was safe. When she walked through the halls of Dragonstone after claiming it, she saw the carvings her ancestors left behind. Dragons, flames, the sigils of old Valyria. She touched the cold stone and imagined a world where her family still ruled, where her mother never died giving birth in exile, where she wasn't passed from merchant to warlord to Khal, just to survive. A world where maybe, just maybe, Ned Stark had made a different choice. She didn't blame him for her father's death. The Mad King earned his end. Even Daenerys, as much as it hurt, could accept that. But what she couldn't forgive was the silence that came after. The silence that allowed the killing to continue. The silence that allowed her and Viserys to be hunted like animals. It was easy for Westeros to talk about Ned Stark's honor. They spoke of his quiet strength, his loyalty, his truth. But Daenerys had learned in Essos, from slave cities and broken kings, that honor is a luxury. That silence can be just as deadly as a sword. And when she thought about Jon, the boy raised under that silence. Her chest tightened. Jon believed Ned Stark was the greatest man who ever lived. He carried that weight like a shield. He believed in loyalty, in duty, in right and wrong. But Daenerys saw the cracks, because even the most honorable man had lied to him every single day of his life. Every time Jon looked in the mirror, he saw a bastard. Because of Ned. Not the world. Ned. And that lie, that choice, had shaped Jon's soul. It had made him doubt himself, made him question his worth. And when the truth came out, that he was a Targaryen, it didn't free him. It crushed him. Because now he had to carry a bloodline he didn't understand, and a past that had been hidden from him all his life. All because Ned Stark wanted to protect one child by leaving another in the dark. Daenerys walked the halls of King's Landing after the fire had cooled, her feet echoing through ash-covered stone. She didn't regret the war, not the fire, not the fury, because she wasn't just burning a city, she was burning the silence. The silence of men like Ned Stark who watched history fall apart and did nothing except protect their own corners of the world while letting others drown. And so, as the city stood in ruins and the world called her mad, Daenerys stood firm, not as the Mad King's daughter, but as the girl who was never saved. Because no one had ever saved her, especially not the man the world called honorable. She used to think of the North as just another part of the map, cold, far, and irrelevant. But after meeting Jon, after hearing the stories from his lips and seeing the way the Northern Lords bowed only when they chose to, the North started to feel like something else entirely. Not just a place, a symbol of everything that had been denied to her: loyalty, roots, and a home. And at the center of it all again was Ned Stark. He lived like a legend in those lands. People didn't just remember him, they loved him. They spoke about him as though he could do no wrong, as though his decisions were made of gold, and his silence was wisdom. Daenerys hated that. She hated how the people forgave him so easily, how they ignored what his silence had cost others. No one in the North cared that the Targaryen children were chased across the sea like animals. No one cared that her mother had died on a stormy night in a broken castle, alone and terrified. They cared only about their Ned, their quiet wolf, who did what he had to do. But Daenerys couldn't stop asking, what if he had done more? What if he had spoken out? What if he had written to someone, anyone, in Essos? What if he had reached across the sea instead of closing himself off behind ice and honor? But he didn't. He chose safety. He chose stillness. And Jon Snow was proof of that. Every time she looked at Jon after learning the truth, she felt a deep storm inside her. Not just because of what he was, but because of what he never knew. He had spent his whole life thinking he was the outsider, the unwanted one. And Ned Stark let him believe that. Even though Jon carried the blood of two great houses, even though he had every right to know, Ned had stolen that truth from him, and Daenerys knew what stolen truth felt like. She had lived it. In Essos, her whole life was built on whispers. Her name was passed in shadows. She had to fight for every scrap of knowledge about her family. She had to dig for answers no one wanted to give. She had to prove herself over and over, because no one in Westeros cared that a Targaryen still lived. But the North, they cared about their own, about the Starks, not about the girl who came from fire and exile. When she stood in Winterfell, surrounded by stone walls and cold stairs, Daenerys didn't feel welcomed. She felt watched, judged, like an invader, not an ally. Even though she had brought dragons, even though she had come to help fight the dead, it didn't matter, because she wasn't one of them. She wasn't a Stark, and the ghost of Ned Stark was everywhere in that castle. In the silence of the hallways, in the eyes of Sansa, in the way the people looked at Jon. He had been dead for years, and yet somehow he still ruled their hearts. Daenerys realized then that she would never belong, not while the shadow of that man stood between her and these people. She began to feel something colder than hate, a sense of being unseen, of being surrounded by a world that had already made up its mind about who she was and what she could never be. And once again, Ned Stark was at the center of it. The man who had chosen his family over truth. The man who raised her nephew in shame instead of pride. The man who let her family's name turn to dust in the wind and called it honor. That word began to sound like poison in her ears. Because sometimes honor means letting the world burn slowly, as long as your own hands stay clean. Daenerys didn't want to be clean anymore. She wanted to make noise, to change the game, to break the wheel, not polish it like Ned Stark had done. She didn't want to protect one corner of the realm. She wanted to reshape the whole thing. And for that, the North would never accept her, because they were still frozen in the shadow of a man who had done nothing and been loved for it. She had always believed in justice. From the moment she stepped out of her brother's shadow and into the fire, Daenerys told herself that her cause was different. That she wasn't like the men who killed her family or the rulers who sat on thrones while people starved. She believed she was meant to free people, not control them, to build something better, not repeat the mistakes of the past. But Westeros didn't want better. Westeros wanted the same, just dressed in northern cloaks and sweet words like duty and tradition. And no one symbolized that more than Ned Stark. Even after his death, his name was used like a weapon, a quiet one. People measured her against him, compared Jon to him, quoted his sayings as though his way was the only way, the honorable way. But Daenerys had seen what that kind of honor looked like. It looked like dead children, like cities burned in the name of rebellion, like a girl who had to beg for food in foreign markets while men like Ned stood silent in their castles, doing nothing. Still, part of her had hoped Jon would be different. She saw it in his eyes, that raw sense of right and wrong, that part of him that couldn't lie, even when it would have been easier. She thought they were alike, two people burdened by bloodlines and choices they didn't ask for, two leaders shaped by loss. But as time passed, Daenerys saw something else in him. She saw Ned Stark. In the way he hesitated to support her fully, in the way he looked to the Northern Lords for approval, in the way he pulled away from her the moment he learned who he truly was. Jon didn't want the throne, he said. But still, the truth changed everything. His eyes changed. His loyalty cracked. And she realized his heart didn't belong to her. It belonged to the ghost of the man who raised him. The more Daenerys watched him struggle, the more alone she felt. Every time he tried to do the right thing, it was through the lens of Ned Stark's teachings. And she couldn't compete with that. How could she? She had no father to raise her, no Stark words whispered in her ears as a child. She had fire and hunger. She had to teach herself what justice meant while fighting for her life in a world that didn't want her. Jon had his quiet codes and northern honor. Daenerys had scars. And maybe that's why the distance between them started to grow. Slowly at first, like a crack in ice, but then deeper, sharper. When he learned of his true name, he flinched from her, like her blood was poison. And in that moment, she knew she had lost him. Not to the throne, not to fear, to Ned Stark. Even in death, Ned had stolen something from her, a future, a partner, a family. His silence had shaped Jon, and now that silence was pulling Jon away from her. And yet, the world still called her dangerous. They feared her dragons, feared her ambition, but no one feared the quiet lies of men like Ned. No one feared the kind of honor that killed slowly, without fire. That's what made her different, and what made her unforgivable in their eyes. She began to wonder if there was any place in this world where she could belong, where her version of justice could live. She looked at the people who had followed her in Essos, freed slaves, broken women, forgotten men, and she missed them. They hadn't asked her to be Ned Stark. They had followed her because she wasn't. But Westeros didn't want to be saved. It wanted to be preserved. The same houses, the same names, the same cold rules passed down from fathers to sons. And the more Daenerys realized that, the more she felt herself slipping away from the woman she once thought she was. Her heart hardened. Her fire began to burn not just for justice, but for revenge. For everything that had been taken. For every time she was told to wait, to trust, to be patient, while men like Ned Stark were praised for doing nothing. That's when she stopped waiting for their acceptance. She would never be their queen of tradition. She would be their queen of fire. She had always believed that love could save her. Not romantic love, not entirely, but something deeper. A sense of belonging, of finally having someone who saw her, not just the crown or the dragon queen, but the girl who had nothing. The girl who was traded, used, hunted. The girl who built herself up from nothing but ashes and scars. For a while she thought Jon Snow might be that person. Even after she learned who he truly was, Aegon Targaryen, her blood, she wanted to believe that their love was stronger than politics, that it was stronger than names. But she was wrong, because Jon had been raised by a man who made loyalty a cage. Ned Stark had built Jon like a wall, strong, dependable, and emotionally sealed. He raised him on silence, taught him that love was duty, and that truth, even when painful, had to be honored no matter the cost. Daenerys didn't see strength in that. She saw emotional cruelty dressed up as discipline. She saw a man who could lie to his own son's face every day of his life and call it protection. And now that man's ghost was living inside Jon. Daenerys could feel it every time Jon looked at her like she was a stranger. Every time he flinched from her touch after the truth of his blood came out. Every time he looked torn, not between her and the throne, but between her and Ned's legacy. That was the final betrayal, because she had fought, bled, and burned to get to Westeros. She had crossed deserts, survived poisonings, walked through fire. She had freed cities, broken chains, and buried those she loved. And yet none of it seemed to matter. Not to Jon, not to the people, not to the realm. They still chose Starks. Even Sansa, sharp-eyed and cold, had played the game better than Daenerys. She didn't need dragons, she had legacy. The people of the North saw their mother's eyes in her, their father's strength. And no matter what Daenerys did, no matter how many wars she won, she was always going to be an outsider. She saw it clearly after the long night. She had stood with them, fought with them, lost Jorah, her dragon, half her army. But when the fires died down and the people began to gather, they didn't celebrate her. They celebrated Jon, the Northerner, the Stark in all but name, the quiet air of a quiet man who had shaped the North with his silence. It was then Daenerys realized she could never truly have Jon, because Ned Stark still had him, not just in blood, but in soul. Jon would always belong to the North, to Winterfell, to those walls and that history. And Daenerys? She was the storm that came from across the sea, the dragon with foreign fire, the queen who wasn't raised on northern snow, but on whispers of fire and revenge. She began to pull away from him, not out of anger, out of defense. She knew he would never betray her with a sword, but he would betray her with doubt, with hesitation, with the quiet, deadly kind of loyalty that looked like love, but wasn't. And still the world whispered of Ned Stark. Tyrion spoke of his honor, Varys of his integrity. Even Arya carried that silent, steel-edged pride that came from being raised in his house. It was like Daenerys had invaded a kingdom that wasn't ruled by any living man, but by memory. She began to understand something horrifying. She could win the war. She could burn the cities. She could take the throne, but she would never belong. Not while the people still remembered a man who never lifted a sword against her, but still managed to take everything, her family, her future, her place in the realm. Daenerys no longer wanted their love. She no longer believed in earning loyalty. If the realm would only listen to the dead, then she would speak louder, through fire, through fear. Because if Ned Stark's silence shaped Westeros, then Daenerys Targaryen's voice would redefine it. She used to whisper to herself, "I was born to rule." But now, as Daenerys walked through the shattered halls of King's Landing, the crown didn't feel like a destiny anymore. It felt like a burden, heavy, cold and earned in blood. The streets outside were silent, still coated in ash and soot. Mothers cried over the dead. Walls still smoked from dragonfire. And in every broken piece of stone, she heard the same silent judgment that haunted her everywhere. Not from the people, not even from Jon, but from the name that wouldn't die, Ned Stark. He was everywhere, not in body, but in belief, in the way the people reacted to her fire, in how they flinched, how they whispered. They didn't fear her because she had done wrong. They feared her because she had done what Ned Stark never would. She had chosen action. When she stood above the Red Keep, watching the bells toll, she could have shown mercy. She knew it. She felt the pull of restraint. But then she remembered all the mercy her family had never been given. She remembered how Ned Stark had stood by while Robert hunted the last of the Targaryens, how he watched the realm rewrite their history, paint her family as nothing but madness and ruin. And he did nothing. They said he was noble, that he protected Jon by raising him in silence. But Daenerys knew better now. That kind of silence kills louder than swords. It's the kind of silence that rewrites truth, that lets children grow up in shadows, that let her become a stranger in her own birthright. So when the bells rang, she didn't just see surrender. She saw forgiveness, offered to Cersei, to the Lannisters, to all those who had played the game and stained the throne. But not to her, never to her, because she wasn't born in Westeros. She wasn't raised in a stone castle. She didn't have the Stark name, and if mercy only belonged to those who already had the people's love, then she would take respect by fire. They called her mad for it. They called her cruel. But no one called Ned Stark cruel when he let a Targaryen boy grow up unloved, when he let the world think her family deserved to die. No one blamed him for silence. No one questioned the lines he crossed, because he crossed them with a soft face and quiet steps. But Daenerys? She had wings. She had flame, and they would never forgive her for not being like him. That was the truth Jon couldn't face. She saw it every time he looked at her with pain in his eyes. He didn't hate her. He didn't even fully fear her. But he couldn't unlearn what Ned Stark had taught him, that loyalty must look a certain way. That love should be wrapped in silence and sacrifice. That power, real power, must come from restraint. But restraint had never saved her. It hadn't saved her in the Red Waste. It hadn't saved her from poison in Korth. It hadn't saved her from the Sons of the Harpy or from the loss of Viserion. And it sure as hell hadn't saved her family when men like Ned Stark let their enemies rise. And so she burned, not because she loved destruction, but because no one else would do what needed to be done. No one else would remake the world. They all wanted to preserve it, just as it was, as if the system that built thrones from corpses was worth saving. In the quiet after the fire, Daenerys stood alone in the throne room. Ash floated through the air like snow. The Iron Throne waited in front of her, twisted metal, built on 1,000 years of pain. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She felt empty, because even now, after all of it, she knew the people didn't see her on that throne. They saw a dragon, a threat, a queen too wild, too powerful, too foreign. And somewhere in the background of their minds, they compared her to a dead man from the north. A man who had never claimed a throne, never spoken a word too loud, but who the realm still worshipped. That's what Daenerys never forgave. Not that Ned Stark fought her, but that he didn't, and still won. In the end, Daenerys stood alone. The throne room was quiet, almost peaceful. Ash drifted through the broken ceiling like soft snow, settling on the twisted blades of the Iron Throne. The war was over. The city was silent. And for the first time in her life, there was nothing left to chase. No armies to gather. No enemies to defeat. No dreams left untouched by blood. She stepped forward slowly, her boots echoing against the stone floor. This was the moment she had lived for since childhood, since exile, since hunger, since fire. And yet, as she looked at the throne, she didn't feel victory. She felt history watching her. Not the loud kind of history, written in songs and battles, but the quiet kind. The kind that survives because people choose to remember it. The kind Ned Stark had mastered without ever trying. She finally understood it then. Ned Stark didn't rule with power. He ruled with memory. Even dead, he shaped the choices of the living. Jon's hesitation, Sansa's caution, the North's refusal to love her. All of it traced back to one man who had convinced the world that silence was strength and restraint was virtue. And Daenerys had never learned how to fight that kind of enemy. She could burn cities. She could break chains. She could bend armies to her will. But she couldn't burn belief. She couldn't kill an idea that had already taken root in the hearts of millions. That was Ned Stark's true victory. She thought back to the girl she used to be, barefoot in foreign cities, clinging to stories of a home she'd never known. That girl had believed that if she just returned, if she just claimed what was hers, everything would make sense. But Westeros was never her home. It belonged to its memories, its old names, its quiet heroes. And she was never meant to be quiet. When Jon entered the throne room, she already knew how it would end. She saw it in his eyes, the same eyes that once looked at her with trust, now heavy with sorrow. He wasn't there as a lover or a king. He was there as a man torn apart by duty, by Ned Stark's lessons. He spoke of mercy, of fear, of the realm. Words she had heard all her life from men who had never known exile, never known fire. And in that moment she realized something painful and true. Jon loved her, but he loved the world Ned Stark built more. She didn't beg. She didn't rage. She spoke calmly, clearly, like a woman who finally understood the rules of the game she had been playing too late. She spoke of a new world, one without silent suffering, without old lies dressed up as honor. Jon listened, and still he chose differently. Because Ned Stark had taught him that sometimes doing what feels wrong is called doing what is right, that love must be sacrificed for duty. That personal truth means nothing against the weight of tradition, and so the cycle completed itself. As her life faded, Daenerys didn't think of the fire, or the throne, or even her dragons. She thought of a man in the north standing tall and silent, choosing not to speak when it mattered most. A man who never raised a hand against her, yet shaped every tragedy she lived through. That was why she never forgave him. Because Ned Stark proved that you don't need cruelty to destroy someone's future. You just need silence, wrapped in honor. History would remember Daenerys as fire, as madness, as destruction. But history would remember Ned Stark as a good man. And that, more than anything, was the cruelest ending of all.